Area 51, Anomaly. Welcome to the Close Eyes channel. Today's story is the Area 51 Anomaly. A group of friends venture into the desert near the infamous Area 51, where they find the remains of an old military base and creepy artifacts. As night falls, they see strange lights and hear disturbing sounds. Join us as we explore the terrifying mysteries hidden in the Nevada desert. Part 1. I can't tell you why we decided to spend the weekend near Area 51. Maybe it was the thrill of being in a place shrouded in mystery, or the allure of what might be hidden behind those desert horizons. Either way, I found myself driving down a desolate road with 3 friends, Jake, Lily, and Max. Each of us had our own reason for joining this expedition, but I'm certain none of us expected the reality we would face. Our destination was an old, abandoned military facility, rumored to have once been used for secret experiments. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, the facility came into view, an imposing structure partially swallowed by the sand and time. We parked our SUV a safe distance away and approached on foot, our flashlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. The facility was a sprawling complex of rusting metal and crumbling concrete. Vines had claimed most of the walls, and broken windows stared back at us like empty eyes. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints other than our own. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and something metallic. Jake, ever the enthusiast, was the first to push open one of the creaking doors. Inside, the facility's corridors were a labyrinth of peeling paint and broken tiles. Every step we took echoed eerily through the empty halls, amplifying the sense of isolation. The darkness was thick, and despite our flashlights, shadows seemed to cling to the walls with a life of their own. We wandered through the labyrinthine corridors, finding remnants of a bygone era. Rusty filing cabinets, scattered papers, and strange metal contraptions whose purpose was beyond our guessing. Lily, who had a keen interest in history, tried to make sense of the artifacts we stumbled upon. "These look like old scientific equipment," she said, examining a particularly odd device with a tangle of wires and dials. It was then that Max pointed out something unsettling. A series of markings scratched into the walls. They seemed to be a mix of letters and symbols, almost like a cryptic language. "What do you make of these?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, "but they look like they were made in a hurry." The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. A low hum seemed to emanate from the walls, a sound that was both unsettling and inexplicable. We tried to rationalize it, blaming it on old machinery or wind, but it did nothing to ease the creeping unease. We set up our camp in what we assumed was the control room, a large, open space filled with dusty control panels and old monitors. Jake, ever the tech geek, was fascinated by the vintage equipment, while Lily and Max explored other parts of the facility. I was left alone to examine a large map of the area that had been pinned to the wall. It was marked with various locations, some of which were labeled with ominous names like Test Site A and Containment Zone. As night fell, the facility took on an even more sinister tone. The shadows seemed to move with a will of their own, and the darkness outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional flash of distant lightning. We gathered around a makeshift table, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the facility, making us all jump. It came from the direction Max had gone to investigate. "Max!" Jake called out, his voice cracking with concern. There was no response. We rushed down the corridor where we'd last seen him, our flashlights darting around in search of any sign of him. The hum from earlier seemed to have grown louder, and the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath came out in frosty puffs, and a shiver ran down my spine. We called out for Max, but the only response was the eerie silence of the facility and the strange, almost rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I wasn't sure if it was from fear or the cold. Just when we were about to give up and regroup, I noticed something unusual, a faint flickering light coming from a partially opened door at the end of the hallway. It was an unsettling, pulsating glow that seemed to beckon us closer. I hesitated, feeling an instinctive sense of danger, but Jake, ever the brave one, pushed ahead. Pushed. As we approached the door, the thumping sound grew louder, and the temperature plummeted further. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in that unsettling light. It was filled with strange symbols similar to the ones we had seen earlier, and in the center of the room was an odd cylindrical object covered in what looked like glowing runes. My flashlight flickered, and as the light sputtered out, we were enveloped in darkness. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to resonate through the very walls. "Max?" I called out again, my voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. There was no answer. The room felt as though it was closing in on us, the air thick with an oppressive force. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and when I turned around, I saw nothing but darkness and the faint outline of my friends' terrified faces. Panic set in as the strange, otherworldly growl grew louder and closer. In the next moment, the light flickered back on, revealing the room exactly as it was before. Except Max was nowhere to be seen. We were alone. Or at least that's what we thought. Part 2. We were silent for a moment, each of us grappling with the reality of Max's sudden disappearance. The air in the room felt charged, as if it were bristling with some invisible energy. I glanced around, searching for any sign of him, but there was nothing, just the strange symbols and the pulsating light. Jake was the first to break the silence. "We need to find him," he said, his voice resolute despite the fear in his eyes. Lily and I nodded in agreement, though my heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. We retraced our steps through the dark corridors, calling Max's name, but the only response was the echo of our own voices. The facility felt even more disorienting now. The hum from earlier had become a constant background noise, almost like a low-frequency buzz that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The oppressive darkness and the cold made every step feel heavier, and the eerie light from the glowing object seemed to follow us, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. We reached the control room, hoping that Max might have come back there, but it was still empty. The old monitors blinked with static, their screens displaying nothing but interference. Jake checked his phone, but there was no signal. "Of course," he muttered, frustration evident in his voice. "We're cut off from the outside world." Lily took a deep breath. "Let's split up," she suggested. "We might cover more ground that way." I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but I knew it was probably the best option. Jake and I headed towards the north wing, while Lily went back to the area where we had last seen Max. We agreed to use our radios to stay in contact, though the idea of wandering through this desolate place with nothing but a crackling radio for company was unnerving. As Jake and I moved through the labyrinth of hallways, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press in on us from all sides. The light from our flashlights created long, stretching shadows that twisted and flickered in the corners of our vision. The rhythmic thumping from earlier had become a constant presence, now almost synchronized with our footsteps. We came across a room filled with old filing cabinets and dusty records. As we rifled through them, trying to find anything that might offer a clue, the air grew colder still. I could see my breath crystallizing in front of me, and a sense of dread settled heavily in my stomach. Jake suddenly froze, his flashlight illuminating something on the floor. It was a single blood-stained photograph. He picked it up and held it under the light, revealing a picture of a group of people standing in front of the facility. They were wearing military uniforms, but their faces were obscured by shadows and strange distortions, as though they had been deliberately blurred. "What is this?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with unease. "I don't know," I replied, "but it looks like it's been here for a long time." The thumping sound seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to make its presence known. My flashlight flickered again, and I could see shadows moving along the walls, shifting in unnatural ways. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper within the facility. We both jumped, our hearts racing. "That came from the south wing," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. We decided to head towards the source of the noise, our radios crackling with Lily's voice, though we couldn't make out her words. The air grew colder as we approached the south wing, and the thumping sound became almost deafening. My skin was crawling, and I felt a profound sense of impending doom. When we reached the south wing, the corridor was eerily quiet, the thumping sound now a distant memory. The darkness seemed to close in around us, and every corner held a new horror. Our flashlights revealed old military equipment and rusting machinery, but nothing that would explain the earlier crash. We entered a large storage room filled with dusty crates and old broken furniture. As we moved through the room, Jake's flashlight fell on a door that was slightly ajar. "This must be it," he said, pointing towards the door. I hesitated, feeling a cold draft coming from the other side. "Are you sure we should go in there?" I asked. Jake nodded, his face set in determination. "We have to." We pushed open the door and stepped into a small, dimly lit room. It was filled with strange, glowing symbols etched into the walls, similar to those we had seen earlier. In the center of the room was a large metal container with a faintly pulsating light coming from within. The room felt charged with a palpable energy, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. I felt as though we were being watched, the sensation making my skin crawl. Jake approached the container, his curiosity outweighing his fear. He carefully lifted the lid, revealing what looked like a series of strange, metallic devices connected by a network of wires. Before we could investigate further, a sudden, ear-splitting noise erupted from the hallway, followed by the sound of rushing footsteps. We exchanged panicked glances, our radios crackling with Lily's frantic voice, but we couldn't make out the words. We raced back into the corridor, our hearts pounding as we tried to follow the sounds of Lily's voice. The facility seemed to twist and shift around us, as though it were alive and trying to keep us trapped within its walls. The oppressive darkness and the eerie noises made every step feel like a struggle, and I could sense that whatever had taken Max was now closing in on us. Desperation and fear pushed us onward, our only hope of finding Max and escaping the facility before whatever was hunting us could catch up. We rounded a corner and stopped dead in our tracks. There, in the dim light of our flashlights, was Lily. Her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed down the corridor, her voice barely a whisper. "Something's following us. It's not alone." Part 3. Lily's terrified eyes were fixed on the corridor ahead, her voice trembling with fear. I felt a chill run down my spine, the sense of danger that had been lurking at the edges of my perception now fully realized. We stood frozen for a moment, the oppressive darkness around us growing thicker by the second. "What did you see?" Jake asked, his voice urgent. Lily shook her head, unable to find the words. Before we could decide our next move, the sound of footsteps echoed from the darkness. Heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to draw closer with every second. I could feel the floor vibrating beneath us, and the air was charged with an electric tension. "We need to move," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now!" We turned and sprinted down the corridor, the thumping of our own footsteps mingling with the ominous sounds coming from behind. The facility seemed to stretch endlessly, the hallways twisting in impossible ways. We passed by rooms filled with old equipment and strange, half-forgotten artifacts, but we didn't stop to investigate. The lights from our flashlights danced wildly across the walls, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to follow us, inching ever closer. The rhythmic thumping grew louder, more insistent, as if something was relentlessly pursuing us. "Which way do we go?" Lily yelled over the din. "I don't know," I replied, "but we need to find a way out." We rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. In front of us was a large, reinforced door with a faded sign reading "Emergency Exit." Relief surged through me, but as Jake reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked tight, and no amount of pulling or pushing would open it. "No, no, no!" Jake shouted in frustration. "We need to get out of here!" I glanced back down the corridor. The footsteps were getting closer, and the oppressive air seemed to thicken with each passing moment. Panic surged as I realized that we were running out of time. In a last-ditch effort, I turned to the control panel beside the door and began fiddling with the switches and buttons. My hands were shaking, and I could barely make out the instructions in the dim light. The low hum from earlier had become a deafening roar, and the temperature in the corridor dropped even further. "Come on," I muttered, trying to keep my panic at bay. "Please, work." Jake and Lily watched nervously as I struggled with the controls. The footsteps were almost upon us, and the oppressive feeling of being watched intensified. I felt as though invisible eyes were boring into my back, and I could hear the faint guttural growl that had haunted us earlier. With a final desperate push, I slammed my hand down on a large red button. The door emitted a loud, metallic groan, and then, finally, it began to open. A gust of cold air hit us as we stumbled through the door and into a small, dimly lit room. The room was filled with old storage crates and medical equipment, but the most striking feature was a large window that overlooked the facility's exterior. We rushed to the window, hoping to see some sign of the outside world, but all we saw was the dark expanse of the desert, lit only by the distant flash of lightning. "Is there another way out?" Lily asked, her voice cracking with fear. "I don't know," I replied, scanning the room for any possible exits. There was a door on the far side, partially concealed by a stack of crates. "Let's check that." We moved quickly, pushing aside the crates and opening the door. It led to a narrow stairwell that descended into darkness. The air was colder still, and the sound of the thumping footsteps had faded, replaced by an eerie silence. We descended the stairs, our flashlights revealing walls lined with old, rusting pipes and strange markings. The stairs seemed to go on forever, and with each step, the darkness grew more profound. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, and my heart raced as we navigated the descent. Finally, we reached the bottom of the stairs and emerged into a large, underground chamber. It was filled with strange, otherworldly devices and equipment that seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The walls were covered in the same glowing symbols we had seen earlier, and the air was thick with an oppressive, almost tangible force. "What is this place?" Jake whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. "I don't know," I replied, "but it looks like it's some kind of control room." In the center of the chamber was a large circular device with a series of glowing runes etched into its surface. It emitted a soft, pulsating light that bathed the room in an eerie glow. The device seemed to be connected to a network of cables and conduits that snaked through the chamber, leading to various control panels and monitoring screens. As we approached the device, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the oppressive feeling of being watched returned with renewed intensity. I could feel a strange, almost magnetic pull towards the device, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Something's not right," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." Before we could react, the chamber's lights flickered and then went out, plunging us into darkness. The low hum of the machinery grew louder, and the oppressive force in the room seemed to intensify. We were enveloped in an almost tangible darkness, and I could hear the faint guttural growl from earlier, now much closer. The growl grew louder, more distinct, and I felt an icy grip on my shoulder. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The growl was now a chorus of voices, a cacophony of disjointed whispers and anguished cries. "We need to move!" Jake shouted, grabbing my arm. "Now!" We stumbled through the dark, our flashlights barely illuminating the way. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around us, and the growls grew louder, more frantic. The device in the center of the chamber seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and I felt as though we were being drawn towards it. We rounded a corner and found ourselves back in the corridor we had originally entered. The oppressive darkness and the growls seemed to follow us, and the air was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. We raced back towards the stairs, hoping to find an exit, but the facility seemed to twist and shift around us, leading us further into its labyrinthine depths. The growls grew louder, more insistent, and the oppressive force seemed to reach out towards us, pulling us into the darkness. I could feel my strength waning, and the fear of being consumed by the facility was almost overwhelming. We reached the stairs and began the ascent, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness seemed to press in on us, and the oppressive growls were now a constant presence, echoing through the corridors. I felt as though we were being hunted, the facility itself a living entity that sought to trap us within its walls. Finally, we emerged into the control room, the lights flickering back on as we stumbled through the door. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly, but the sense of danger was still palpable. "Where's Max?" Lily asked, her voice filled with desperation. I looked around, but there was still no sign of him. The facility seemed empty and silent, but the feeling of being watched was still present. We had to find him and get out of this place before it was too late. Part 4. We gathered ourselves in the control room, the oppressive darkness that had enveloped us before now receding slightly as the lights flickered back to life. The facility's eerie hum continued, a constant reminder of the unseen forces at play. Our flashlights cast long, jittery shadows on the walls, making it seem as though the facility itself was alive and watching us. The control room seemed oddly untouched, as if it had been waiting for us to return. The old monitors and control panels blinked with static, but there was nothing on the screens to help us make sense of what was happening. The room's sterile emptiness was unsettling, and the once familiar surroundings now felt alien and menacing. Jake paced nervously, his face drawn with worry. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice strained. "But we can't leave Max behind." Lily nodded in agreement, her eyes red from the strain. "We have to find him. There's got to be some clue, something we missed." I agreed, though my own fear was mounting. The feeling of being watched had never left, and now it seemed to intensify. My skin crawled with the sensation of invisible eyes following our every move. I scanned the control room, looking for anything that might offer a clue. On one of the control panels, I noticed a blinking red light. I approached it, my flashlight casting a harsh beam on the panel. The display read, "Emergency Broadcast System." It seemed to be transmitting, but the signal was garbled and intermittent. I fiddled with the controls, hoping to get a clearer signal. Suddenly, a loud, distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "Warning! Containment breach! Unauthorized access!" The message was fragmented, but it was clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. Containment breach was not a term I wanted to hear right now. I looked at Jake and Lily, who were watching anxiously. "What does that mean?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "It means something's gotten loose," Jake said grimly, "and we're probably not alone." The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The feeling of dread was almost suffocating, and I could hear the distant rhythmic thumping that seemed to be growing louder once more. My flashlight dimmed, and I could see the oppressive darkness closing in around us. I moved to the door, trying to listen for any signs of movement. The thumping sound was now accompanied by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to resonate through the facility's walls. The noise was unsettling, a reminder of the danger lurking just out of sight. "We have to keep moving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to find Max and get out of here." We exited the control room and made our way back through the facility, our flashlights slicing through the darkness. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to press in on us, and the growls and thumping sounds grew louder with each step. The facility felt like a maze, the corridors twisting and turning in impossible ways. We came across more of the strange symbols etched into the walls. The markings seemed to be growing more complex and sinister, and I could feel a sense of malevolence emanating from them. The air was thick with an almost tangible sense of dread, and every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. As we turned a corner, we heard a loud crash followed by a series of disjointed, frantic noises. The sound came from a nearby room, and we rushed towards it, our hearts pounding with fear. We burst into the room to find a scene of chaos. Old filing cabinets and equipment were strewn about, and the room was filled with a thick, acrid smoke. In the center of the room was a large metal container, similar to the one we had seen earlier. It was dented and scorched, and the glow from within was now a flickering, erratic light. Jake approached the container cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the strange symbols that covered its surface. The air was filled with a sense of foreboding, and the growls seemed to be growing louder. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang echoed through the room, and the container's lid flew off, landing with a deafening crash. The pulsating light from within the container grew brighter, and a strange, otherworldly figure began to emerge. It was a creature of darkness and shadow, its form shifting and changing as it moved. It had no discernible features, just a swirling mass of darkness with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The growls and whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of tortured voices. We stumbled back, our fear overwhelming. The creature's presence was suffocating, its darkness almost tangible. I felt as though it was feeding off our fear, growing stronger with every second. "We need to get out of here!" I shouted, grabbing Jake and Lily. "Now!" We fled the room, the creature's growls echoing behind us. The facility seemed to close in around us, the shadows stretching and shifting in unnatural ways. We raced through the corridors, the thumping sound and the growls growing louder and more frantic. Our flashlights flickered, and the oppressive darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming, and every corner held a new terror. We could hear the creature's growls growing closer, its presence a constant, suffocating pressure. We reached the stairs and began to ascend, the darkness growing thicker and more oppressive with every step. The growls were now a deafening roar, and the sense of impending doom was almost unbearable. Finally, we burst into the control room, the lights flickering back on as we stumbled through the door. The creature's growls were now a distant echo, but the oppressive sense of dread remained. "We need to find a way out," I said, trying to steady my breath, "before it finds us again." Jake and Lily nodded, their faces pale with fear. We had to find Max and escape this place before it was too late. The facility seemed to be alive, its darkness and malevolence closing in around us. Every moment we spent here increased the danger, and we had to move quickly to avoid being trapped forever. Part 5. We regrouped in the control room, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we tried to calm ourselves. The oppressive darkness had lifted slightly, but the facility still felt menacing and alive. The growls and thumping noises from before had faded, but the sense of dread remained palpable. Jake, his face pale and sweaty, turned to us. "We can't just stay here. We need to find Max and get out of here before that thing comes back." Lily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "But where do we even start looking? The facility is like a maze." I glanced around the control room, searching for anything that might help us. The monitors, still displaying nothing but static, were frustratingly unhelpful. The only other option was to explore further and hope to find some clue to Max's whereabouts. "There's got to be a map or something," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We need to figure out where we haven't been yet." Jake and Lily began rummaging through the drawers and shelves in the control room, looking for any documents or maps that might give us a clearer picture of the facility's layout. I focused on the old monitors, trying to see if any of them might offer a hint. As I examined the monitors, one of them flickered and briefly showed a grainy image of what looked like an underground lab. The image was too distorted to make out clearly, but it gave me a faint glimmer of hope. "I think I saw something," I said, pointing to the screen. It looked like a lab or storage area. Jake and Lily joined me at the monitors, and we all stared at the flickering image. "If that's an underground lab, it might be worth checking out," Jake said. "It could have more clues or maybe even some way to help us escape." With renewed determination, we left the control room and headed back into the labyrinth of the facility. The oppressive darkness seemed to follow us, and every corner we turned seemed to bring us deeper into the maze. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. We followed the faintest of signs that might lead us to the underground lab. The facility's layout was more confusing than ever, and it felt like the walls themselves were shifting, making our journey even more treacherous. The growls and thumping noises had stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left us. After what felt like hours of wandering, we finally arrived at a large, reinforced door with a faded sign that read, "Sub-level access." The door was locked, but there was a small control panel beside it. I approached the panel, hoping that we could bypass the lock. The panel had several buttons and a keypad. I hesitated, knowing that messing with it could trigger another alarm or worse, but there was no other choice. I took a deep breath and began to work on the controls, trying to bypass the lock. Jake and Lily stood behind me, their faces tense with anticipation. The air around us felt charged with a sense of urgency. I could hear the faint hum of machinery and the occasional creak of the facility settling around us. Finally, with a loud click, the door unlocked. I pushed it open, revealing a dark, narrow stairwell that led further down into the facility. The air was colder here, and the oppressive atmosphere grew thicker. We descended the stairs, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the environment became. The walls were covered in strange symbols and markings, and the air was filled with a low, pulsating hum. At the bottom of the stairs, we emerged into a large underground lab. The room was filled with rows of old equipment, strange devices, and scientific instruments. It was a jumble of outdated technology and forgotten experiments, all covered in layers of dust and grime. In the center of the lab was a large glass observation chamber. Inside, there were several mysterious artifacts and strange devices, including a series of glowing orbs that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. "Look at this," Lily said, pointing to a set of old files and documents scattered across a table. "Maybe there's something here that can help us understand what's going on." We gathered around the table and began to sift through the files. Most of them were too faded and damaged to be of much use, but a few had readable notes and diagrams. One file in particular caught my eye. It was labeled Project Anomaly and contained detailed diagrams of the facility and its various sections. The diagrams showed a network of interconnected rooms and labs, including several areas labeled with ominous names like Containment Zone and Experiment Site. There was also a detailed layout of the underground lab, with several marked points of interest. "This might be it," I said, holding up the file. "These diagrams could help us navigate the facility and find Max." We studied the diagrams closely, trying to make sense of the layout. There was a marked location labeled Emergency Containment that seemed to be in the general direction of where we had heard the growls and thumping noises. "If we head towards the emergency containment area, we might find more clues or possibly even Max," Jake suggested. We set out again, following the map's directions. The journey was slow and fraught with tension, as the facility seemed to be constantly shifting around us. The oppressive atmosphere and the sense of being watched never left us, and every step felt like a struggle against an unseen force. As we approached the emergency containment area, the temperature dropped sharply and the air grew colder. The feeling of dread was almost overwhelming, and the sense of being hunted returned with a vengeance. We reached a large, heavy door with a faded warning sign. It was locked, but there was a control panel beside it. I hesitated, feeling the weight of our situation pressing down on me. The facility's malevolence seemed to be growing stronger, and I could feel the oppressive force closing in around us. "We need to get through this door," I said, my voice resolute. "There's no other way." Jake and Lily nodded, their faces pale with fear. We had come this far, and we couldn't turn back now. I approached the control panel, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. As I worked on the controls, I could hear faint, disjointed voices and whispers, as though the facility itself was speaking to us. With a final, determined push, the door unlocked with a loud click. I pushed it open, revealing a dark, cavernous room filled with strange, glowing symbols and mysterious artifacts. The air was thick with an almost tangible energy, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. We stepped into the room, our flashlights illuminating the strange symbols and artifacts. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in around us, and the sense of danger was palpable. In the center of the room was a large cylindrical device covered in glowing runes. It was similar to the device we had seen earlier, but much larger and more complex. The device emitted a faint pulsating light, and the air around it seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy. "What is this place?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, trying to steady my breath. "But we need to find Max and get out of here before it's too late." The room felt alive with an oppressive force, and the sense of danger was almost unbearable. We had to find Max and escape the facility before whatever was lurking here found us. Every moment we spent in this place increased the danger, and we had to move quickly to avoid being trapped forever. Part 6. As we moved further into the cavernous room, the air grew heavier, laden with a palpable sense of dread. The pulsating light from the large cylindrical device cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the room feel even more surreal and menacing. The strange symbols etched into the walls seemed to glow faintly, adding to the room's otherworldly atmosphere. Jake, his face lined with exhaustion and fear, turned to us. "We have to keep our wits about us. This place is designed to mess with your head. Max could be anywhere." Lily nodded, her eyes scanning the room anxiously. Let's split up and see if we can find any clues, but stay close and don't stray too far. We agreed to this plan and began our search. I focused on the area around the cylindrical device, hoping it might hold some answers. The glowing runes were intricate and complex, and I could almost feel them vibrating with an unnatural energy. The device itself was humming softly, its light casting unsettling patterns on the floor. I examined the device closely, trying to decipher the runes. They seemed to form a repeating pattern, but their meaning was eluding me. I could hear faint, disjointed whispers in the background, growing louder and more insistent as I approached the device. Come on, I muttered to myself. Figure it out. Suddenly a loud metallic clang echoed through the room, followed by a series of frantic thumps. My heart raced, and I spun around, flashlight darting through the darkness. The noise seemed to be coming from one of the far corners of the room. Jake! Lily! I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. There was no immediate response, just the oppressive silence and the ever-present hum of the device. I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow as I cautiously moved towards the source of the noise. The air was colder here, and the sense of danger seemed to intensify. As I rounded the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A large metal crate had been toppled over, its contents scattered across the floor. Among the debris were several old, rusty tools and strange, alien-looking devices. But what caught my eye was a faint, glowing symbol on one of the walls, directly above where the crate had fallen. The symbol was different from the others, more intricate and pulsating with a dark energy. It seemed to be drawing power from the cylindrical device, and the room's oppressive atmosphere felt even thicker around it. I approached the symbol cautiously, feeling a strange pull towards it. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of anguished cries. I could barely make out the words, but they were pleading, desperate, and filled with a deep sense of sorrow. Help us! Find peace! The voices seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if they were trapped within the facility's confines. I could feel a cold, clammy presence behind me, and I turned to see Jake and Lily approaching, their faces etched with concern. What's going on? Jake asked, his voice tense. There's something strange about this symbol, I said, pointing to the glowing rune. It feels different. Lily examined the symbol closely, her eyes widening in recognition. I've seen this before, in some of the files we found earlier. It was associated with some kind of containment or energy field. The oppressive atmosphere grew even thicker, and the whispers seemed to intensify. I could feel the weight of the facility pressing down on us, and the sense of danger was almost unbearable. Suddenly, the cylindrical device emitted a blinding flash of light, and the entire room shook violently. We were thrown off our feet, and the room was plunged into darkness. The pulsating light from the device flickered erratically, casting terrifying shadows on the walls. Get up! Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. We need to get out of here! We scrambled to our feet, disoriented and frightened. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in around us, and the sense of being hunted was overwhelming. The whispers and growls had returned, merging into a cacophony of tortured voices. The device's hum had grown louder, more insistent, and the air was charged with an almost palpable energy. I could feel the presence of something malevolent, lurking just out of sight. We raced towards the door, but it was blocked by a large, heavy crate that had fallen from a nearby shelf. We struggled to move it, but it was too heavy and unwieldy. Help me! I shouted, trying to push the crate aside. We have to get out! Jake and Lily joined me, and together we managed to shove the crate out of the way. The door was finally clear, but it was locked tight. I fumbled with the control panel, my hands shaking with fear and desperation. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching. The oppressive force in the room seemed to be drawing closer, and the sense of impending doom was almost unbearable. With a final desperate push, I managed to bypass the lock and open the door. We stumbled through, gasping for breath, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly as we left the room behind. We found ourselves in a narrow corridor, lit only by the dim glow of emergency lights. The oppressive darkness and the growls seemed to be fading, but the sense of danger was still very real. Where do we go now? Lily asked, her voice trembling. I glanced at the map we had found earlier. There's a maintenance tunnel nearby. It might be a way out. We followed the map's directions, our steps echoing through the corridor. The air was colder here, and the feeling of being watched never left us. The whispers and growls were now distant, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. We reached the maintenance tunnel, a small, cramped space that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The air was musty and filled with the smell of decay. We have to keep moving, I said, trying to stay calm. We need to find Max and get out of here. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, its twists and turns leading us deeper into the facility's labyrinthine depths. Every shadow and sound heightened our sense of fear, and the oppressive atmosphere made every step a struggle. Finally, we emerged into a large, open chamber. The air was cold and dry, and the room was filled with strange, alien artifacts and glowing symbols. It looked like some kind of research facility, but the oppressive atmosphere and the sense of danger remained. We searched the room quickly, hoping to find some sign of Max. The chamber was filled with old equipment and strange devices, but there was no sign of him. As we moved towards a large observation window, I caught a glimpse of movement outside. The facility was surrounded by the vast empty desert, and the sky was filled with dark, roiling clouds. A storm was brewing, and the distant lightning added to the sense of foreboding. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the chamber, and the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the oppressive sense of dread returned with a vengeance. We were enveloped in an almost tangible darkness, the growls and whispers growing louder and more insistent. I could feel a cold, clammy presence behind me, and the feeling of being hunted was almost overwhelming. "We need to get out of here!" Jake shouted, grabbing my arm. "Now!" We stumbled through the darkness, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick blackness. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around us, and the growls and whispers grew louder and more frantic. Finally, we reached the end of the chamber and found another door. I fumbled with the controls, trying to bypass the lock. The oppressive darkness and the sense of danger were almost unbearable. With a final desperate push, I managed to open the door, and we stumbled into a narrow, winding corridor. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly, but the sense of danger was still very real. We had to find Max and escape the facility before it was too late. The oppressive darkness and the sense of being hunted were constant reminders of the danger we faced. Part 7. The narrow corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls lined with old, rusted piping and strange, pulsating lights. The oppressive darkness seemed to recede slightly, but the sense of foreboding was ever present. We moved quickly, our footsteps echoing off the walls, the oppressive silence around us making every sound seem amplified. The corridor eventually opened up into a larger chamber filled with old dusty equipment and forgotten technology. The room was illuminated by the eerie glow of a few malfunctioning lights, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. It was clear that this place hadn't seen activity in years, but something about it felt unnervingly alive. "Keep your eyes peeled," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're looking for anything that might help us find Max." We split up again, searching through the abandoned equipment and debris. The air was thick with dust, and every breath felt heavy. The silence was occasionally broken by the distant rumble of thunder and the faint, eerie whispers that seemed to follow us. As I rummaged through a pile of old files and documents, I found a faded photograph. It showed a group of scientists standing in front of what appeared to be a large, metallic structure, similar to the cylindrical device we had seen earlier. There were several handwritten notes on the back of the photograph, but they were too faded to read clearly. I pocketed the photograph and continued searching. Nearby, I found an old, locked cabinet. With some effort, I managed to force it open, revealing a collection of strange artifacts and devices. Among them was a small, intricately carved box. It had a faint, pulsating light emanating from it, similar to the devices we had seen earlier. Jake and Lily were investigating a set of old control panels on the other side of the room. They were trying to make sense of the ancient technology, hoping it might provide some clue to our situation. "Hey, check this out," Jake said, his voice tinged with excitement. "I think this might be a communication device or something." The panel was covered in a web of wires and switches, and after some fiddling, Jake managed to get it working. A crackling noise filled the room, and an old, distorted voice began to speak through the speakers. "Warning! Unauthorized access! Containment breach!" The message was garbled and fragmented, but it was clear that the facility was on high alert. The voice seemed to be repeating a warning about a breach or containment issue. "This isn't good," Lily said, her face pale. "It sounds like whatever is in this place is still a threat." We gathered around the communication device, trying to make sense of the message. The growls and whispers had faded, but the sense of danger was still palpable. We needed to find Max quickly and get out before the situation worsened. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The oppressive silence was broken by a loud mechanical grinding noise, and the floor began to tremble. The room was shaking, and the feeling of danger grew stronger. "We need to move," I shouted, trying to stay calm. "Something's happening." We stumbled through the darkness, trying to find an exit. The trembling grew more intense, and the walls seemed to close in around us. The oppressive atmosphere and the sense of being hunted were overwhelming. Finally, the shaking subsided, and the lights flickered back on. We found ourselves in a small, dimly lit room with a single door on the far side. The room was filled with strange, alien artifacts and glowing symbols, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. We approached the door cautiously, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The door was partially open, and we could see a faint light emanating from the other side. As we moved towards the door, I heard a faint, familiar voice. It was coming from the other side, and it sounded like Max. "Max!" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. "Are you there?" The voice responded, but it was weak and strained. "Help. Trapped." We pushed the door open, revealing a narrow, dark corridor beyond. The air was colder here, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow thicker. We entered the corridor, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The corridor twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the facility's labyrinth. The whispers and growls had returned, growing louder and more insistent with every step. The feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. After what felt like an eternity of winding through the dark corridors, we arrived at a large, heavily reinforced door. It was covered in strange symbols and had a faded warning sign that read, "Emergency Containment." "This must be it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to get through this door." The door was locked tight, but there was a control panel beside it. I approached the panel, trying to bypass the lock. The oppressive atmosphere and the sense of danger were almost unbearable, and the whispers seemed to be growing louder. With a final, determined push, I managed to bypass the lock and open the door. We stumbled into a large, dimly lit chamber. The air was cold and dry, and the room was filled with strange, alien artifacts and glowing symbols. In the center of the room was a large metal containment unit. The unit was covered in glowing runes, and the air around it seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The unit's door was slightly ajar, and a faint light was emanating from within. We approached the containment unit cautiously, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The feeling of danger was almost overwhelming, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on us from all sides. "Max!" I called out, trying to see inside the unit. "Are you in there?" The light within the unit flickered, and we could see a figure moving inside. It was Max, but he was unconscious and seemed to be restrained by strange, glowing bands. "We have to get him out!" Lily shouted, her voice filled with desperation. I examined the containment unit, looking for a way to release Max. The glowing runes seemed to be forming a protective barrier, and the air around the unit was filled with a low, pulsating hum. I found a control panel beside the unit and began to work on it, trying to override the containment field. The oppressive atmosphere and the sense of danger were almost unbearable, and the whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of tortured voices. With a final, desperate push, I managed to disable the containment field. The glowing bands around Max flickered and faded, and the door of the unit opened with a loud hiss. We rushed to Max's side, helping him out of the containment unit. He was weak and disoriented, but he seemed to be recovering. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly, but the sense of danger was still very real. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to stay calm. before something else happens. We helped Max to his feet, and we began to make our way back through the facility. The oppressive darkness and the feeling of being hunted never left us, but we were determined to escape before it was too late. Every step we took felt like a struggle against the facility's malevolent forces, and the sense of urgency grew with each passing moment. Part 8. The journey back through the facility was fraught with tension and fear. Max, though still weak, managed to walk with our help, but every sound and shadow seemed to heighten our anxiety. The oppressive darkness and the feeling of being hunted were constant reminders of the danger we faced. We retraced our steps through the labyrinthine corridors, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers and growls seemed to be growing more frantic, and the sense of being watched was ever present. It felt as though the facility itself was trying to prevent our escape. "This place is a nightmare," Jake said, his voice strained. "We need to find the quickest way out." We followed the map we had found earlier, trying to navigate through the maze of corridors. The oppressive atmosphere and the sense of danger seemed to press down on us, making every step feel like a struggle. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out again, plunging the corridor into darkness. The oppressive silence was broken by the sound of distant, echoing footsteps and a low, rumbling growl. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. "Stay close," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to move quickly." We stumbled through the darkness, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick blackness. The growls and whispers grew louder, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around us. We reached a junction in the corridor, and I glanced at the map, trying to figure out the quickest route to the exit. The map showed a series of interconnected tunnels and access points, and we had to navigate through them to reach the surface. As we turned down one of the tunnels, we were met with an unexpected sight. The tunnel was lined with strange, glowing symbols, similar to those we had seen in the containment chamber. The symbols seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and the air was filled with a faint, almost melodic hum. "What is this?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, trying to stay calm. "But we need to keep moving." The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, and the oppressive darkness made it difficult to see. The sense of being watched was almost suffocating, and the whispers and growls grew louder with every step. We finally reached a large, heavy door at the end of the tunnel. The door was marked with strange symbols and had a faded warning sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." It was locked tight, but there was a control panel beside it. I approached the panel, trying to bypass the lock. The oppressive atmosphere and the sense of danger were almost unbearable, and the whispers seemed to be growing louder. With a final, determined push, I managed to override the lock and open the door. We stumbled through into a large open chamber filled with old, dusty equipment and strange artifacts. The chamber was dimly lit, and the air was thick with dust and decay. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly, but the sense of danger remained. We had to find the exit quickly. We searched the chamber for any signs of an exit, and finally, we found a small door marked "Emergency Exit." It was partially open, and a faint light was emanating from the other side. "We're almost out," Jake said, his voice filled with relief. "Let's go." We rushed through the door, emerging into a narrow, dimly lit tunnel. The air was cooler here, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly. We followed the tunnel, our steps echoing through the darkness. The tunnel led us to a series of metal stairs, which we climbed quickly. The sense of urgency was overwhelming, and the whispers and growls seemed to be fading as we neared the surface. Finally, we emerged into the open air. The night sky was filled with dark, roiling clouds, and the distant lightning illuminated the vast, empty desert. The oppressive atmosphere and the feeling of being hunted seemed to lift as we stepped out of the facility. "We made it," Lily said, her voice trembling with relief. "But we have to keep moving." We looked back at the facility, its dark silhouette looming ominously against the night sky. The sense of danger was still very real, and we knew that we couldn't stay in the area for long. We made our way back to our vehicle, which was parked a short distance away. Max, though still weak, managed to get inside, and we quickly drove away from the facility. The oppressive darkness and the sense of being watched seemed to fade as we left the area behind. As we drove through the desert, the storm clouds continued to churn overhead, and the distant lightning cast eerie shadows on the landscape. The facility was now a distant memory, but the sense of dread and the experiences we had endured would stay with us forever. We were finally safe, but the haunting memories of what we had witnessed in the facility would never fully leave us. The growls, whispers, and the oppressive atmosphere were constant reminders of the malevolent forces that lurked in the darkness. The journey had been terrifying and traumatic, but we had survived. We had faced unimaginable horrors and come out the other side, scarred but alive. The facility near Area 51 had revealed its dark secrets, and we had escaped with our lives. But the sense of unease and the lingering fear would stay with us for a long time to come. As the storm raged on, we drove into the night, leaving the desert and the facility behind. The memories of our harrowing experience were etched into our minds, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the veil of reality. Part 9. The drive through the desert was a blur of shifting shadows and distant flashes of lightning. The storm had intensified, and the wind howled through the night, rattling our vehicle. The oppressive darkness seemed to follow us, and the fear of what we had escaped lingered heavily. Max, still shaken and weak, sat silently in the back seat, his eyes wide and distant. Lily and Jake were both on edge, their faces pale and their voices subdued. The sense of relief from escaping the facility was mingled with the trauma of our experience. "We need to get out of here," Lily said, her voice strained. "We need to find a place to regroup and figure out what just happened." I nodded, my mind racing as I drove. The road ahead was treacherous, and the storm made visibility almost impossible. Every flash of lightning illuminated the twisted, barren landscape, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. After what felt like hours, we reached a small, run-down motel on the edge of a remote town. The place looked deserted, and the flickering neon sign overhead cast a dim, eerie glow. It seemed like the only option available, so we pulled into the parking lot and parked the vehicle. The motel's office was dark, but the door was unlocked. I pushed it open and we entered the small, dimly lit room. The smell of stale air and old, damp carpet filled the space. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a weary expression, glanced up as we entered. "We need a room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And we need it now." She nodded, handing over a key without a word. We took the key and made our way to the room, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The room was small and musty, with a single bed and an old worn-out armchair. It wasn't much, but it was a temporary refuge from the storm and the horrors we had faced. We settled into the room, trying to calm down and process what had happened. Max was lying on the bed, wrapped in a blanket, while Lily and Jake sat in the armchair, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. "This place is a nightmare," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell was that facility? And what was that thing we saw?" "I don't know," I replied, running a hand through my hair. But it was clear that something was wrong there. Those symbols, the containment unit, the whispers. It all felt so wrong. Lily nodded, her eyes dark and troubled. "The whispers we heard, they sounded like they were pleading for help. Like there were people trapped there, suffering. The weight of our experience was heavy, and the oppressive fear from the facility seemed to cling to us, even in this small, run-down motel room. We needed answers, but they felt just out of reach." As we tried to calm down, the storm outside continued to rage, its howling winds and driving rain adding to the atmosphere of dread. The intermittent flashes of lightning cast unsettling shadows on the walls, making the room feel even more claustrophobic. Suddenly, there was a loud metallic clang from outside the room. We all jumped, our hearts racing. The noise seemed to come from the direction of the parking lot, and it was followed by the sound of footsteps. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Yeah," I said, trying to stay calm. "It sounds like someone's out there." We listened intently, the sounds of the storm mingling with the faint, rhythmic thumping from outside. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the metallic clang seemed to come from different directions. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, "but we need to check it out." We cautiously opened the door and peered into the hallway. The area was dark and empty, and the only sound was the distant rumble of thunder. We stepped out into the hallway, our footsteps muffled by the old carpet. The metallic clanging was louder now, and it seemed to be coming from the parking lot. We made our way to the door leading outside, and I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The storm was still raging, and the wind howled through the deserted parking lot. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it difficult to see. The metallic noises continued, and we saw a figure moving in the distance, partially obscured by the rain. "Who's out there?" I shouted, trying to be heard over the storm. "Show yourself!" The figure turned, and we could see a shadowy form moving towards us. The shape was indistinct, but it seemed to be shrouded in darkness, almost as if it were a part of the storm itself. As the figure drew closer, we could see that it was a man, dressed in a tattered military uniform. His face was hidden beneath a weathered helmet, and he moved with a strange, unsteady gait. "Help us," the figure croaked, his voice barely audible over the storm. I felt a chill run down my spine. The man's voice was eerily familiar, and the words he spoke seemed to echo the whispers we had heard in the facility. The figure's presence was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure took a few more steps towards us, and the metallic clanging grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the chains and equipment that hung from his uniform. "We can't escape," he rasped. "You must help us." Before we could react, the figure collapsed to the ground, the rain pouring down around him. We rushed to his side, but he was already unconscious, his body shivering uncontrollably. "This is crazy," Jake said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What is happening?" "I don't know," I replied, trying to stay calm. "But we need to get him inside and find out what's going on." We helped the man into the motel room, laying him on the bed. His condition was worsening, and he seemed to be in a state of shock. The metallic clanging from his uniform was constant, and the oppressive atmosphere in the room seemed to grow heavier. Lily examined the man, her face pale and concerned. "We need to get him help, but I don't know if there's anything we can do." The storm outside continued to rage, its howling winds and driving rain adding to the sense of dread. The man's presence seemed to amplify the oppressive fear we had felt since leaving the facility. We were trapped in this small motel room, facing an unknown threat and haunted by the memories of our experience in the facility. The metallic clanging and the man's pleading voice were constant reminders of the darkness that still pursued us. As the night wore on, the storm showed no signs of letting up, and the oppressive atmosphere in the room was almost unbearable. The figure's condition was worsening, and the whispers and growls seemed to echo through the storm. We were left with more questions than answers, and the sense of danger was ever present. The facility near Area 51 had left its mark on us, and the dark secrets it held seemed to be following us, even in this small, run-down motel. The fear and uncertainty were palpable, and we could only hope that we would find the answers we needed before it was too late. Part 10. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, the wind shrieking through the cracked windows and rain lashing against the walls. The small motel room felt increasingly claustrophobic as we tried to deal with the unconscious man we had brought inside. His presence seemed to amplify the already oppressive atmosphere, and the room was thick with an uneasy tension. We watched over him as he lay on the bed, his body shivering uncontrollably. The metallic clanging from his uniform created an eerie rhythm that echoed through the room. Despite our best efforts to comfort him, his condition appeared to be deteriorating. Lily, who had some medical training, did her best to assess the man's state. "He's in bad shape," she said, her voice trembling. "He might be suffering from hypothermia and shock. We need to get him warm and try to stabilize him." We did our best to wrap him in blankets and get him as comfortable as possible. The storm's howling seemed to seep into the room, and the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier. It was as if the storm itself was a manifestation of the malevolence we had encountered. Jake paced nervously, his face etched with worry. "What do you think he was trying to tell us? Why did he come here?" "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But it's clear that he's connected to whatever we experienced at the facility. Maybe he knows something about it. The whispers and growls we had heard earlier seemed to echo in the back of our minds, mingling with the storm's cacophony. The oppressive fear we had felt at the facility had followed us here, and it was impossible to escape. The man's condition worsened as the night dragged on, and we struggled to keep him stable. Despite our efforts, he remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. The sense of urgency was overwhelming, and every minute felt like a struggle against the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, there was a loud, guttural roar from outside, followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal. The noise was so jarring that it sent us all into a state of panic. "What was that?" Lily shouted, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I said, my heart racing. "But we need to check it out." We cautiously made our way outside, bracing ourselves against the storm's fury. The parking lot was drenched, and the lightning cast eerie, flickering shadows across the scene. The metallic clanging continued, and the source of the noise seemed to be coming from the direction of the facility we had escaped. The sense of dread was palpable as we approached the source of the noise. The storm had intensified, and the wind howled through the deserted parking lot. The oppressive darkness seemed to press down on us, making every step feel like a struggle. As we neared the edge of the parking lot, we saw a strange, flickering light in the distance. It was coming from the direction of the facility, and it seemed to be accompanied by a series of rhythmic, pulsating noises. "This has to be connected to the facility," Jake said, his voice trembling. "We need to find out what's happening." We followed the flickering light and the pulsating noises, making our way through the storm. The facility's silhouette loomed ominously in the distance, its dark, twisted form partially obscured by the storm. The flickering light grew brighter as we approached, and the rhythmic noises became more distinct. It sounded like a series of metallic clangs and low, guttural growls, mixed with the eerie whispers we had heard before. As we reached the edge of the facility, we saw a group of shadowy figures moving around the perimeter. They were dressed in tattered military uniforms and appeared to be working with strange, glowing devices. The figures moved with a sense of urgency, their movements almost mechanical. "Who are they?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding, "but we need to be careful." We watched from the shadows, trying to make sense of the scene. The figures seemed to be performing some kind of ritual or operation, using the glowing devices to manipulate the facility's structures. The air was filled with a low, resonant hum, and the oppressive darkness seemed to grow heavier. Suddenly, one of the figures turned, and we could see its face. It was a ghostly, hollow-eyed visage, and the sight was so disturbing that it made us all recoil in fear. "Get back!" I shouted, pulling us away from the scene. "We need to find cover." We retreated to a nearby storage shed, its flimsy walls providing little protection from the storm. Inside, we huddled together, trying to process what we had seen. "What were those things?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, trying to stay calm. "But they're connected to whatever's happening at the facility. We need to find out what they're doing." The storm continued its assault, the wind howling through the shed and the rain pouring down in torrents. The oppressive fear and sense of danger were almost unbearable, and we were left with more questions than answers. The facility's dark presence loomed over us, and the strange figures and their glowing devices only added to the sense of dread. We knew we had to uncover the truth, but the risk was higher than ever. As the night wore on, we remained hidden in the shed, trying to stay out of sight. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the facility's ominous presence seemed to press down on us from all sides. The sense of foreboding was overwhelming, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to seep into every corner of our minds. We were trapped in this small shed, haunted by the memories of our experience and the dark secrets of the facility. The storm continued its relentless assault, and the dark figures moved with a sense of purpose outside. We were left to confront the fear and uncertainty of our situation, hoping that we would find the answers we needed before it was too late. The darkness seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the storm's fury mirrored the malevolence that we had encountered in the facility. As dawn approached, the storm began to wane, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. We knew that our ordeal was far from over, and the dark secrets of the facility would continue to haunt us as we searched for answers. The journey through the desert and the horrors of the facility had left an indelible mark on us, and the sense of danger was ever present as we faced the unknown.